GoForThe2.com. We're into the Week 7 predictions for the college football season. It doesn't get better than this. We have some great games on tap this coming weekend. And for me, it starts on Thursday night with a marquee SEC battle. Auburn, coming off a bye week, travels to Lexington to take on the upstart Kentucky Wildcats. All signs point to Kentucky in this matchup, but I like Auburn in this game for a couple of factors. One, they're coming off a bye week, which I think will benefit quarterback Sean White, and I like Gus Malzahn's scheme going up against a suspect Kentucky defense in terms of run support. Kentucky's given up about 170 rushing yards per game. I like the up-tempo attack, and I look for Gus Malzahn to run that Kentucky defense sideline to sideline. I think that'll open up the play-action passing game for Sean White. You look at this Kentucky team overall, not creating a lot of turnovers. The team is even in turnover margin through 6 games. And you look at the offensive line for Kentucky, allowing 19 sacks on the year. I think Will Muschamp has an extra week of preparation on the defensive side of the ball, and I look for Auburn to be up into this game. It's a conference ball game. I think the tempo of Auburn's way too much, and I think they do get a convincing Thursday night victory in Lexington. I think Auburn's able to break through and put up 44 on Kentucky. I think it's Auburn 44, Kentucky 24, and the Tigers move on to 4-2 on the year. Let's stay in the SEC Saturday, a marquee game in College Station. Alabama, 5-1, travels to Kyle Field to take on the undefeated Texas A&M Aggies. This is another game where Texas A&M is coming off a bye week, and I think the bye week will benefit the Aggies in this matchup on both sides of the ball. Not only does Kevin Sumlin have an extra week to prepare against that Alabama defense, but defensive coordinator John Chavis does have an extra week to get that defense prepared for Jake Coker and Derrick Henry in this game. You look at Alabama last week, they had a methodical victory over Arkansas, 27-13 over the Arkansas Razorbacks. They trailed that game 7-3 late in the third quarter before Jay Coker hit Calvin Ridley on a deep pass that allowed Alabama to jump up 10-7 in the fourth quarter. Reggie Ragland and that defense took over, and the Alabama Crimson Tide did get a convincing fourth quarter domination victory, 27-13. But now they have to go back on the road. Keep in mind, 2 weeks ago, they had an emotional game in Athens, dominated the Georgia Bulldogs 38-10. They came home and faced a very blue-collar offense and defense in the Arkansas Razorbacks. They pushed them to the limit, pushed them into the second half. They expended a lot of energy. Now Alabama has to go on the road to face a very potent offense in Texas A&M. Alabama struggled with mobile quarterbacks. You can look at that game against Ole Miss. Chad Kelly burned them, not only in terms of the deep third, in terms of the vertical passing game, but he also burned them with his mobility on the edge. Kyle Allen's the same type of quarterback, completing over 61% of his passes. He has big play weapons on the outside like Christian Kirk and Speedy Noel and Josh Reynolds that can give that Alabama secondary some mismatch problems. The way you beat Alabama is to attack the deep middle or the seams of the Alabama defense. I think Texas A&M has the offense that can put a lot of pressure on that Alabama secondary, and I think this is a really bad matchup for the Crimson Tide from a defensive perspective. I think if Texas A&M strikes fast, that'll put a lot of pressure on Jacob Coker. He's still inconsistent, in my opinion, did not have a solid four-quarter game at home in Tuscaloosa against a methodical Arkansas defense. You look at Texas A&M overall, they have a solid pass rusher in Myles Garrett that leads that team with 7.5 sacks. Overall, this is a unit that has 19 sacks on the year, and the way you beat Texas A&M is to run the football. So I think that's going to be the game plan for Alabama, to utilize Derrick Henry, run off tackle the way Arkansas did a few weeks ago. The only problem with Arkansas was they held an 8-point lead going into the fourth quarter. They could not close the door. If Alabama jumps up early, I think it'll be a long day for Texas A&M. But I really believe that Texas A&M, with the extra week to prepare, will be ready for this ball game. I think they jump out and put the pressure on the Alabama offense. That was the one thing that Ole Miss did that forced Alabama out of the game plan. They jumped up 17-3, held a 17-10 halftime lead on the Alabama Crimson Tide, and never allowed Alabama to maintain that lead. They put the pressure on Jake Coker Coker to come from behind, and I think Texas A&M is built the same type of way and it will put the pressure on Alabama in this game. I think it's high scoring, but in the end, I do think Texas A&M gets the convincing victory. I think they get a 41-31 victory over the Alabama Crimson Tide. I think it's a double-digit victory. I think Texas A&M is gelling, playing very well on the defensive side of the ball. They're only giving up about 192 passing yards per game. I like Myles Garrett to get some pressure on Jay Coker and the offensive line of Alabama, and I do think that the wide receivers do create some mismatch problems for the secondary of the Crimson Tide, and I think Texas A&M rolls 41-31 on Saturday. Another interesting matchup, Iowa goes on the road to face Northwestern. Northwestern coming off a disappointing 38-0 shutout loss in Ann Arbor, a methodical victory by the Wolverines. They took the opening kickoff the distance, they took it to the house, allowed Michigan to jump up 7-0, and that defense beat up Northwestern and quarterback Thurston in that game. They forced him to make reads, something he could not do. He's going to be facing another blue-collar team in Iowa, coming off a 29-20 victory over West Lunt and the Fighting Illini. It was a methodical win. Jordan Canzeri broke out for 256 rushing yards. The offensive line for Iowa playing very, very well. This is an Iowa team that's built very solid on the offense and defensive lines. Defensive unit has 19 sacks on the year, led by Drew Ott and Nate Meyer, who are a dominant duo in the middle of that Iowa defense. They can clog running lanes, put a lot of pressure on Thorson and that offensive line for Northwestern, and I think this is a difficult spot for the Wildcats to rebound. I know they're at home, but they're going to be facing a very upstart, confident Iowa Hawkeye team with a solid head coach in Kirk Ferentz. To me, this is possibly one of the best teams in the Big Ten. They're still going under the radar. I called for Iowa to win their share of the division back in June. I'm sticking by it. I like C.J. Beathard at the quarterback position. He's able to stretch defenses vertically. This is a defense in Iowa that's only allowing 77 rushing yards per game. Very solid on the defensive front. They could take away the rushing attack of Northwestern and again force Thorson to throw over the top of the defense. I'm not sold in the redshirt freshman, and I like Beathard in this matchup. You look at Iowa overall, 3-2 over the last 5 years against Northwestern. They've come by an average margin of victory of 19.3 points per game. Like the way the offense and defensive lines are playing for Iowa, and I do think that they get another convincing victory over the Wildcats. I think it's a 34-13 victory over Northwestern this coming weekend. The Hawkeyes move to 7-0 on the year. Another interesting matchup takes place in Tallahassee, Florida State and Louisville. Florida State coming off an emotional victory over arch rival Miami, 29-24. Dalvin Cook broke out. They held the lead much of the game, never surrendered it. Florida State defensively looked very good in the second half of that ball game. I like the matchups against Louisville in this matchup. Louisville has a very inexperienced wide receiver group. Louisville did win 2 games in a row against Sanford and North Carolina State on the road, but I think the speed of Florida State's the difference in this matchup. Florida State +5 in turnover margin, still only allowing around 195 passing yards per game, and I like the offensive line going up against the defensive front of Louisville. I think they're a bit undersized, and I like the way Everett Golson's come along in the system, got more acclimated. He faced a very solid Miami defense and made solid decisions. I'm not sold on this Louisville team, especially on the road, and I think Florida State breaks out in this matchup. I know Dalvin Cook is a little banged up. I don't think it matters. I think Everett Golson is able to throw over the top of the secondary, and I think the speed on the outside by Florida State is the difference. I like the matchups in the secondary with Ramsey going up against the Louisville wide receivers, and I think Florida State does get a convincing victory on Saturday night in Tallahassee. I think Florida State puts up a 45 spot. I think 45-28, Florida State gets the victory over Louisville. Florida State moves on and remains unbeaten. This is an ACC game. Look for the Seminoles to be up into this matchup, and I think they get back-to-back ACC victories I think it's a convincing victory Saturday night over Louisville. Another intriguing matchup takes place in the Big 12. It's an early start, Baylor and West Virginia. This was a game last year that West Virginia dominated. They beat up on Bryce Petty. They got a convincing victory at home in Morgantown. They put up 468 total yards on the Baylor defense. This was a Baylor team that came into that matchup after they won an emotional come-from-behind victory over TCU last year, 61-58. They went on the road to Morgantown. They committed 18 penalties for 218 yards in that game that allowed Clint Trickett and Kevin White to break out. They also won the turnover battle 3-0 against West Virginia, but could not capitalize on that game. Secondary of West Virginia played very well. Well, fast forward to 2015. Baylor has a #1 ranked offense. They've been hitting on all cylinders. They put up a 60 spot on Kansas last week on the road in Lawrence. Seth Russell playing very well in the system. Meanwhile, West Virginia has lost back-to-back games to Oklahoma State in overtime and 2 weeks ago against Oklahoma. But now they go on the road for a Big 12 matchup. I like West Virginia to keep this game close. I like Wendell Smallwood. I like Russell Shell to control the tempo of this matchup. Skylar Howard makes solid decisions, but he's a mobile quarterback that can get away from the pass rush of Baylor. This is a pass rush for the Baylor Bears that only has 11 sacks on the year. They're very solid in run support, but I like the tempo of West Virginia, and I like the defense of West Virginia, only giving up about 140 rushing yards per game. I think they can control Shock Linwood in this matchup. They've been opportunistic up until this point and played a solid Oklahoma State team last week at home in Morgantown. They trailed that game much of the first half, came back, they showed resolve. They got that game tied at 26 before they lost it in overtime. I like the way West Virginia's playing. Even though they've dropped 2 straight, I think they're built very good on the offensive defensive lines, and I think they can slow down the up-tempo attack of Baylor and keep it close within striking distance. I think in the end, Baylor does win this game, but I think it is very, very close. I like West Virginia to be in this game from start to finish. I think Baylor gets a 10-point victory at home in Waco. I think it's very high scoring. I think it's 51-41. Baylor prevails, but West Virginia exploits some holes in that Bears defense. Keep in mind, Baylor's averaging 10.2 penalties per game. This is what bit Baylor last year in the big game in Morgantown. They're still not disciplined, creating a lot of pre-snap penalties that could affect them in a tight Big 12 game. I think West Virginia's up for this game. Their backs are against the wall. They need to put their best foot forward, and I think West Virginia keeps it close from start to finish. Another intriguing matchup on Saturday, Utah coming off a very impressive 30-24 victory over Cal. They had Cal on the ropes for much of that game, created 5 turnovers, and held on for the 30-24 victory. But they're going to be playing an upstart Arizona State team that is coming off back-to-back Pac-12 victories over Colorado and UCLA. This Arizona State team is 4-0 over Utah the last 4 games, and they've won those games by an average margin of victory of 13.2 points per game. Last 2 games have been very close. Last year in Tempe, Arizona State won a 16-13 game in overtime. Taylor Kelly and that offense played very methodical. They wore down Utah in the overtime period, picked up a 3-point victory. 2 years ago in Salt Lake City, Arizona State won a 20-19 victory. So Utah's played Arizona State very tough. But this is an Arizona State team that seems to be gelling at just the right time. Defense is playing very well, especially against the run. And I think that that's where they can contain Utah's running back Devontae Booker, who seems to be 80% of the offense. Utah overall only throwing for 187 passing yards per game. Mike Bercovici, Arizona State's quarterback, completing over 60% of his passes. Those wide receivers of DJ Foster and Tim White and Gary Chambers seem to be getting more acclimated in Todd Graham's system. They have more cohesiveness as a unit, and I like Bercovici going up against Travis Wilson in this matchup. You look at this Arizona State team. I picked this team to win their division in the Pac-12 and get to the championship game. If they knock off Utah, this could be an upstart team that will be 5-2 on the year. I like Arizona State's speed on the outside. I like the way they match up against the Utah secondary. And I still don't like the fact that Utah revolves most of their offense around running back Devontae Booker. I think Arizona State wins this game outright. I think it's high scoring. I think Arizona State gets into the 40s. I think it's a 48-41 victory for Arizona State in this matchup. They move on to 5-2 and hand the Utah Utes their first loss on the year. Another intriguing matchup is Ohio State, Penn State. Ohio State hasn't looked like the same team last year in terms of dominating their opponents. They won last week. They were pushed again to the limit in the second half by Maryland. Maryland's head coach, Randy Edsall, is now fired, but Ohio State did pull away in the fourth quarter, got a convincing 49-28 victory over Maryland. But you look at this Ohio State team overall, very balanced offensively. They're averaging 230 rushing yards per game, averaging 230 passing yards per game. Cardale Jones struggled a little bit early on in that matchup, but got acclimated. J.T. Barrett came on in red zone situations and played very, very well. Ezekiel Elliott averaging over 8 yards per carry. He's the heart and soul of that offense. Defensively, this is a team in Ohio State that has 19 sacks on the year. They're still negative in turnover margin, and to me, that's the MO why Ohio State's not putting together more dominant victories. So they need to get their turnover margin back on track. Still negative in turnover margin midway through the season, but they're going to be going up against a very physical blue-collar team in Penn State. This is a statistical defense in Penn State that is very solid against the run. They're a top 20 defense that has 25 sacks on the year and led by defensive tackle Carl Nassib, who has 10 sacks on the year. So this is a dominant defense by Penn State. Blue collar, they're going to stuff the running lanes and force the Ohio State Buckeyes wide receivers to work down the field. I like Ohio State to do that. I like the speed on the edge, but I look at the offense for Penn State. Christian Hackenberg broke out last week with 4 total touchdowns, 2 through the air and 2 on the ground. But this is an offensive line in Penn State that allowed 19 sacks on the year. Keep in mind, 10 of those came in the Week 1 loss to Temple. Reason why Penn State hasn't been giving up a lot of sacks is that James Franklin and the offensive staff have been keeping a very close, methodical, conservative attack in terms of running the football. Penn State's averaging 157 rushing yards per game. Through the air, they're only averaging 187 passing yards per game. So that's why Hackenberg hasn't put up the type of numbers, because I feel that James Franklin is concerned about the offensive line. If they do open it up, that could put a lot of pressure on the offensive line, and that's why Penn State's played very conservative up until this point. Look for Ohio State to dictate the tempo on the defensive side of the ball. I look for Ohio State and Urban Meyer to blitz, put a lot of pressure on that offensive line, and I think if in order for Penn State to win this game, they're going to have to throw over the top. I don't think they can do it. Chris Goodwin is the only breakout receiver for the Penn State Lions, had a solid game last week, and Penn State did take advantage of a suspect Indiana defense last week that was allowing 336 passing yards per game. Ohio State has a better secondary. They have better interior linemen, and I think this is a very difficult matchup for the Penn State Lions. I think Ohio State dominates. You'll see the number 1 team in the country this coming Saturday night in Columbus. I think they take Penn State. They dominate this matchup. I think Penn State doesn't get more than 13 points in this game. I think Ohio State puts up a 50 spot. I like Ohio State to dominate this matchup. Ohio State 50, Penn State 13. I think you'll see the number 1 team in the country break out at home in front of a national audience against Christian Hackenberg. I think Penn State is still one-dimensional at this point in the season. Keep in mind that Penn State pushed Ohio State to the limit last year, 31-24 in Happy Valley. It was an overtime victory for Ohio State. Do not expect Ohio State to overlook the Nittany Lions. I think they put their best foot forward and break out offensively. Ohio State 50, Penn State 13.